Over the last quarter century, gaming has changed quite a bit to say the least. Modern iterations of what used to be great industry titans like Halo and Call of Duty are almost unrecognizable from the predecessors that made them into household names. Then you have franchises like Command & Conquer, which haven't seen a proper release since the late 2000s. Most recently, there was the long-awaited Stalker 2, which I did a whole video on a few weeks ago on why that didn't exactly live up to expectations. With time, many of our favorite games have been morphed into something that at best looks like a poor imitation of the source material, or at worst, they've become overhyped nostalgia-fueled cash cows. But the franchise we're going to be taking a look at today is a bit of an odd one, as it once dominated store shelves in the late 90s and early 2000s, before fading into total obscurity with little mention in the gaming discourse today. If you couldn't already tell by the title and thumbnail of this video, we are of course talking about Army Men. Originally developed by a now infamous company called 3DO, the Army Men franchise was a series of games based around the premise of sentient, self-aware toy soldiers, or Army Men, hence the name, that were locked in a never-ending conflict between armies of different colors. What made this franchise stand out was that instead of the typical wargame backdrops of Europe, the Middle East, or sci-fi settings that were all too common in the late 90s and early 2000s, the games instead shrunk the player down to the size of a 2-inch soldier, and took place within the confines of supersized bedrooms, kitchens, front porches, and backyards. The series tagline Real Combat Plastic Men summarized it well. Think of the Toy Story movies, but instead of being focused on not getting left behind during the family move, they were centered around global warfare, alien portals, and giant bugs. Though Army Men was a series about children's toys, it often took inspiration from real-life historical figures and conflicts as well, with many of the characters, buildings, settings, and factions being a loose symbolic representation of their real-life counterparts, particularly in the earlier titles. And this was by design, as the developers originally wanted to make a game that was somewhat grounded, but due to the many ongoing censorship issues of the 90s, particularly in Germany, the developers opted to have Army Men be themed around small plastic soldiers instead of real ones, with Chris Wilson, the producer of the original game, going on to say, quote, "The Germans are extremely uptight about realistic violence. Command & Conquer, for instance, changed all its units into robots and had to change some of the cutscenes. But we didn't want to have to do two versions, and very early on in the design process, we'd been planning things out with plastic Army Men." For those of you watching today who perhaps weren't around or don't remember, the 90s into the late 2000s even were a drastically different time for video games and media as a whole. There were a lot of controversies and general panic amongst the public, and with that, a real fear of many games being effectively banned, usually due to restrictions around violent content. At that time, there was a great hysteria where many games that today most wouldn't even flinch at were considered to be a major driving force of real-world violence. These views were held by many parents, news stations, and governments alike. It was due to this cultural concern that Army Men was created the way it was, for better or worse, to avoid any kind of censorship or controversy. As such, the earlier entries in the series are for the most part quite grounded and much like our own world, with the only real difference being that the soldiers are made of plastic instead of flesh and blood. Everything else is exactly how it would normally be, just shrunk down to miniature size to match an appropriate scale to complement the 2-inch figures the series was centered around. However, this more grounded approach is not what the series would be remembered for. Subsequent releases would embrace the Toy Story-like setting and include the aforementioned supersized battlefields as well as bizarre plot elements like giant talking bugs, golf ball-powered WMDs, and transferring the brain power of plastic soldiers into apes. Yes, the Army Men lore is absolutely wild, and during the early 2000s these games were virtually inescapable, with releases on PC, nearly every console at the time, and even mobile phones. No, not just smartphones. Army Men was released for your grandma's flip phone. Suffice to say, these games were at one point virtually everywhere, and as such, it had a huge impact on gaming as a whole. So with such a widespread reach, why is it then that this series has been almost completely forgotten? Other old franchises like Doom and Wolfenstein are still going strong. Command & Conquer, while effectively dead, still has quite an active community, with copycat games like Tempest Rising released somewhat frequently. So what happened to Army Men? How did one of the most well-known games of its time, that had an impact on so many people's childhoods, just fade into this level of obscurity where it's not even mentioned today? Before I get further into it, I just want to note here that while this video was originally going to be relatively short, the scope and scale of it has far surpassed what it was initially intended to be. Timestamps as such will be in the description below, though I do recommend sticking around to the end as there is a lot of interesting information, from leaked emails to bad ports, legal scandals, and some stuff that is just straight up weird. Suffice to say, the rabbit hole goes pretty deep. But that out of the way, please consider leaving a like if you do end up enjoying, and without further ado, let's pick up an auto rifle, step into an ancient portal, and fly right in to the tumultuous history, obscure lore, and ultimate downfall of one of gaming's biggest forgotten franchises.
3DO.
The original Army Men released in 1998, but before we get too far ahead, I can't make a video about Army Men without first giving a bit of background information on the developers behind it. The 3DO company, whose name is a sort of acronym for the term three-dimensional optics, was founded by Trip Hawkins, a man with a storied and significant role in gaming history. Prior to his founding of 3DO and overseeing the development of the Army Men games, in his younger years, Hawkins had attempted to make a knockoff version of popular tabletop football games, which failed. In the late 1970s, he found himself amongst the first employees at Apple, where he worked as the director of strategy and marketing before leaving in 1982 to found his own company called Amazon Software. Due to disagreement around the name among his original employees, by the end of that year, he would go on to rename the company to Electronic Arts. You might have heard of them, and a few of their titles. In 1991, Hawkins steps down as the CEO of EA for a variety of reasons and founded the 3DO company, which was originally created with the sole purpose of developing a brand new console that would simply be called the 3DO. What differentiated the 3DO from others of its time was the fact that it would be manufactured not by the 3DO company themselves, but by a varied array of partners and licensees, sort of like how modern Blu-ray players work. Companies such as Gold Star and Panasonic would produce the 3DO consoles, with others like AT&T, Toshiba, and even Samsung acquiring a license to do so. 3DO would make money by collecting royalty payments on each console sold and each game manufactured for those consoles, albeit at a much cheaper rate than that of competitors at only $3 per game sale, which is equivalent to roughly $7 today. This was an absurdly low royalty fee for the time and even by today's standards. The problem with this policy, however, would become apparent with time. The first major issue was that while the low prices did draw many developers to make games specifically for the 3DO console, the low barrier to entry would result in a serious lack of quality control and standards. In total, 246 games would be officially released for the 3DO, ranging everything from RPGs and sports games to some more, let's say, adult-themed content, which would give the 3DO a bit of a bad reputation, especially among parents at a time when panic around video games as a medium was at an all-time high. The other, bigger problem was the cost. Most console manufacturers sell their systems at a loss, instead bringing in most of their revenue from royalties sourced from the games sold on their platform. However, 3DO's model, where developers were charged very small royalties, meant that the systems had to be sold for a profit, and this led to the 3DO console being priced at $699 in 1993, which is a sum of approximately $1,500 in today's money. Compared to its competitors, such as the PlayStation, the 3DO console was not only more than twice the price, but it also lacked a decent collection of games, launching with only one. The subsequent releases of low-quality games mixed with many adult-oriented titles only further served to give the 3DO console a bad reputation. While the low royalty fee did attract many developers at first, in the long run, due to low sales of the console and even lower sales of the games made for it, many developers, including 3DO themselves, ceased making games for the system. To make matters worse, Panasonic, the first manufacturer of the console, didn't produce enough units to distribute, leading to most stores only stocking one or two consoles on launch day. Ultimately, the 3DO system would only end up selling between 1.5 and 2 million units, and as such, was a complete commercial failure. And that brings us back to the topic of this video. By 1995, the 3DO company had been operating at a loss for quite some time, and thus sold off the rights to their would-be next-gen console, the M2, and laid off over 100 of their 400-plus employees in a dramatic restructuring of the company. By mid-1997, it had sold off the last remnants of its hardware business to Samsung for $20 million, and it was clear that 3DO needed a new strategy. In late April of 1998, the first Army Men game would release, with a Game Boy Color version coming out 2 years later. It's important to note that the two versions of these games differ drastically from one another, and that's a trend we're going to see going forward with most of these games. In the late 90s and early 2000s, version parity, which is to say, for example, the version of a game on Xbox being almost the exact same game on PC, and so on, was not the industry standard. In fact, during that time, many games that released on multiple systems ended up being two distinct games despite sharing the same name. Sometimes they had a smaller title, usually in finer print underneath the main title, while other times they would just have slightly different cover art, with the latter being the case with the original Army Men. Further releases in the franchise would follow this trend even more so. For example, Army Men World War on PC is a weird mix of isometric shooter and real-time tactics, while Army Men World War on PlayStation is a third-person shooter, a completely different genre. Things got real confusing when at one point the 3DO company was releasing multiple titles per year, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s. Here is a chart of all the Army Men games from the series' 1998 inception to the present. There are 24 named titles in total, not counting the unique separate versions that were platform dependent. Obviously, with this many games being released in such a short period of time, the quality was varied, to say the least. It generally ranged from semi-decent cult classic hits with things like Sarges Heroes, Army Men 2, and Air Attack being fan favorites, and then there were others that were received as derivative cash grabs like Portal Runner, a spin-off that took heavy inspiration from the Tomb Raider series and was panned by critics. In fact, Game Informer, who were the first to review it, rated the game a 2.3 out of 5, a rating that so badly offended 3DO's CEO Trip Hawkins that he went out of his way to write an angry email to GamePro, which was leaked to the public. The email reads, quote, "We are reevaluating our relationship with GamePro as a result of your review. The audience for games no longer consists of one iconic block of angry young men who cannot get a date on a Saturday night. We wanted to include boys, girls, women, and casual gaming men. Meanwhile, I personally think we made a game that hardcore adult male gamers would enjoy, but I can understand that some of them would reject it in the same way some adults reject Shrek or Beethoven." Yes, he actually said that. Back to the email. But personally, I think that really means there is something wrong with a man like that, not with Portal Runner. If you disagree with me, you do so at your own peril. As you know, most game publishers are losing money and have cut back on advertising. Many magazines and webzines have perished. What seems needless to me is the often overtly negative tone that gaming editorial takes, and do not patronize me by telling me the reader is the customer. Your real customer is the one that pays your revenue, and that is industry advertisers. And I should mention in passing that 3DO has been one of your largest advertisers. Effective immediately, we are going to cut that back. In conclusion, you owe us one, because you took us by surprise and threw our review to a wolf." End quote. Wow, well that's a lot to unpack. Start off by calling your most dedicated fans losers and rejects, end with bombastically arrogant threats and trying to tell GamePro you basically own them. Well, for those of us with a little knowledge of gaming history, we know exactly how poorly Mr. Hawkins' email would age, as about 2 years later it would in fact be 3DO, not GamePro, who would go out of business and file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in late May of 2003, while GamePro would go on to exist for another decade. I guess betraying your core fan base, belittling them, and trying to sell out to a broader audience isn't the way to go, 3DO. In all fairness, in 2020, Trip Hawkins did an AMA with Netflix to promote a then-upcoming documentary, and he said the following, quote, "If I could go back in time and change anything, it would be to manage my temperament better. I was young, immature, and volatile, subconsciously terrified of failure and could lose it emotionally if my team couldn't come to a consensus. I was a passionate leader, but also an immature one at that time." So while it does certainly seem that Hawkins' mentality may have changed over the years, the email still definitely shows his attitude towards the end of 3DO's existence was one of hostility and resentment towards those who were critical of some of their later decisions with the franchise, and I don't think this really helped. 3DO's last few years in general were plagued with a mixed bag of hastily produced, mediocre releases that prioritized quantity over quality. There were, of course, a few successes, like the aforementioned Sarges Heroes and Air Attack games. Sarges Heroes was a third-person shooter that followed an entirely new timeline and was presented in a much more lighthearted tone compared to that of the originals, with more focus on actual characters versus generic, effectively nameless soldiers. While Sarges Heroes was a decent game for its time, Army Men Air Attack, not to be confused with Army Men Air Tactics, which was a PC exclusive that utilized basically the same box art as Air Attack, but was built off of Army Men 2's engine. I know, confusing. But anyway, Air Attack was, at least in my opinion, one of 3DO's best games by far and a highlight of the series. I'm a big fan of Army Men 2 in the original, and Sarges Heroes isn't bad, but Air Attack and its sequel really knocked it out of the park. A fantastic soundtrack, a straight-to-the-point, wacky storyline that fit right in with the one established by Sarges Heroes, and gameplay that was essentially 3DO's version of Soviet Strike, but with more focus on action over strategy. It was basically an arcade-style shoot-'em-up game where you play as one of 4 helicopters and use said helicopters to wreak havoc on the tan and blue soldiers below. Now my poll from a few weeks ago makes sense. Anyways, this game is where I think the Army Men series as a concept shines the most. The developers really leaned into the unique setting and used it to come up with some pretty interesting scenarios, from rescuing giant laser-shooting teddy bears to putting a stop to the Tan Army's evil experiments on talking bugs. This game was jam-packed with levels that were pure fun, and despite it being a low-poly game from the early 2000s, you really feel a sense of accomplishment when you win. This is, for instance, what happens when you free those bugs.
We're free.
The game also does a great job of making you feel like a total screw-up and scolding you when you fail.
You really screwed up this time. What are you doing? Do you think this is a game?
Great plastic junk! A green base is under attack! We lost the building! Bring it home! This mission is a bust!
Oh, and how could I forget the co-pilots? In Air Attack, before each mission, you get to pick what type of helicopter you'll be using, more of which are unlocked as you progress through the game's levels. Once you've done that, you get to pick your co-pilot, which are these sort of Saturday morning cartoon character archetypes, and they provide different bonuses depending on which ones you pick. The first 3 you unlock are Woodstock, Hardcore, and Rawhide, with each having their own unique lines that will play depending on what you're doing during gameplay. These lines range from funny stereotypes like,
"Somebody say tea time? Tally ho, baby!"
to just plain weird.
I'm gonna blow more than your mind.
If you've never got to experience an Army Men game before, I would say this one is by far the best one to just pick up and play. It's a good introductory point for newcomers, and it's truly unique. We really don't see games like this anymore. And if the series would have just stopped there, I think most people would have remembered these games a lot more fondly than they do. But unfortunately, after Air Attack is where things start to fall apart. From my research, it seems that most fans tend to point to Portal Runner in 2001 as the beginning of the end, but I think the cracks started to show a bit before. While the original Army Men games are, for the most part, pretty decent, it was around the very tail end of the 90s, during hit games like Army Men 2 and Air Attack's development cycle, that something was going on behind the scenes at 3DO. Remember that chart I showed earlier detailing all the releases of Army Men games over the course of a single decade? Note the fact that in 1999 alone, there were 5 different titled games released. This is not counting the unique system-dependent variants of those games, like World War, for example. Then in 2000, we got another 5 games. Then in 2001, there were 6 more games released. So in total, over the course of just 3 years, there were 16 plus games released, with the quality of each subsequent one generally declining from the last. And this was something that became increasingly hard to ignore, with multiple game reviewers, including the earlier mentioned GamePro, directing a lot of criticism and bad ratings towards 3DO. In 2021, it was actually revealed by the former creative director of Sarges Heroes, Michael Mentheim, that the primary issue was the executives at the company, who forced quarterly releases, hence the overabundance of lackluster, unpolished games. Put simply, the team at 3DO just didn't have enough time, and Army Men as a brand was essentially being exploited by the higher-ups for a quick profit. A big reason for this being the need to recoup lost profits from the failed 3DO console of just a few years earlier. Suffice to say, things only got worse over time, and Army Men Toys in Space is the first game where the problem with 3DO's quantity over quality business model became too obvious to ignore. It came out not even a month after Sarges Heroes in late 1999 and was in so many ways the canary in the coal mine. Toys in Space was the last of the isometric games to follow the original storyline, and was built off of Army Men 2's engine. However, despite it seemingly being a sequel, it offered no conclusion or even any recognition of the cliffhanger that Army Men 2 had ended up. The worst part of the game by far has to be the controls. For some reason, Toys in Space cannot effectively be controlled with a keyboard like the games before it. Using the WASD keys to turn the character results in a delayed, unresponsive input that is almost impossible to use, thus forcing the player to use the mouse instead. Why this is the case when it wasn't in the previous games is anyone's guess. In terms of gameplay additions, Toys in Space adds in loads of new units, weapons, and power-ups, plus the ability to directly control squad members. This wasn't without drawbacks, however, as the developers for some reason removed the unique character stats that were added in Army Men 2. It's a bit strange, as you would think with the new ability to control NPCs directly, those stats might come in handy. After all, in Army Men 2, leveling up a random soldier to 5 stars could make them quite powerful, so it really gave the player incentive to keep their allies alive. But sadly, in Toys in Space, this unique feature is entirely absent. Combine that with the clunky controls, and Toys in Space feels like an interesting but poorly executed concept at best. Its campaign levels are bland and uninteresting, the story is generic and poorly written, and unfortunately drops nearly all of the interesting plot elements from the previous 2 games. It overall ends up feeling like a disconnected spin-off that's meant to be part of another timeline, only it isn't. We'll return to that specifically and in much greater detail later in the video, because it's a whole rabbit hole in and of itself that needs its own section to be properly addressed. So after Toys in Space released in October of 1999, 3DO pumped out Air Attack in November, then ported Sarges Heroes to PlayStation in late February of the following year, followed up by Air Tactics in March that same year, before finally releasing World War on console in early April, with the PC version to come about a month later. This was all on top of 3DO also producing several other games outside the Army Men franchise simultaneously, such as High Heat Baseball, which released only a single day before Army Men Air Tactics on March 7th of 2000. To say the staff at 3DO were working under crunch time conditions would be putting it lightly. Let's talk specifically about that last one though, World War. So as mentioned towards the beginning of this video, World War is a completely different game on PC than it is on console. In fact, they're not even in the same genre. The console version of the game is okay, but even for its time, the controls are particularly clunky. The visuals are dated, and the levels extremely linear. As a result, it received generally unfavorable reviews from critics. Bear in mind, this game came out in the year 2000. Only a year and change later, we would get the first Halo. So in terms of quality and standards, there's no comparison. And this was becoming an issue with pretty much all of 3DO's games at this point, where the quality of the games themselves and the technology behind them was years behind the competition. The PC version of World War wasn't much better, and released on the 2nd of May 2000, just a few months after the PlayStation version. I have to stress again, other than the name and the fact that these were both themed around toy soldiers, the PC version of World War and the console version have absolutely nothing in common. Instead of a third-person shooter, World War on PC is an isometric game that deceptively looks similar to the original Army Men, but for some reason now has the player starting as multiple characters, similar to the system Easy Red 2 uses, where if the player character dies, they simply play as the next man in the squad. If their squad dies, they switch to another squad. If all squads die, it's game over. It's a bit unusual, though it's not a bad system in itself per se. After all, I am a massive fan of Easy Red 2. I just don't understand why 3DO would implement it into a game that never had it before. Like I said, it looks just like the other original Army Men's, but it plays so much different. The new squad system cuts in half the amount of weapons you could carry in favor of encouraging the player to strategically micromanage soldiers, which the player will then have to toggle between playing as, depending on the situation. The only problem with it is there's no actual reason to do this. Whatever character you're playing as can usually get the job done by themselves. Mobbing enemy positions or charging in with a tank is just as effective as strategically planning an attack, and most missions are only about 5 minutes long anyways, so there's never any real time or reason to feel invested in the squad mechanics. The unique stat system from Army Men 2 is much like in Toys in Space absent here, which only further makes the new squad system feel pointless. What does return from Toys in Space, however, is the awfully irresponsive controls. Then you have the presentation. Army Men World War on PC looks awful even for its time. Now, I know the other isometric Army Men's were never anything particularly amazing, and of course they were very dated by today's standards visually, but they still have a certain level of beauty and charm to them. Army Men 2 still looks great 2.5 decades later, but World War for some reason looks grainy, and much of the game is way too bright. Parts of it are oversaturated with, even for the time, low-res textures, and then there's the sound design. Compare World at War's bazooka sound to that of the originals. One sounds very powerful and the other one just sounds muted, not like an explosive launcher at all. Most of the sounds in this game, in fact, are a major downgrade, including the voice acting. While voice acting has never been Army Men's strong suit, World Wars is exceptionally bad, and this is a trend a lot of the 3DO games unfortunately started to follow as well. Have a listen.
Yo Will, ride. Yo Will, ride.
It's almost like these voice actors weren't taking their roles seriously and were using some really bad equipment to record some of the lines. This wasn't the case much with the previous games. Sure, they weren't perfect, but they were a lot better than this. It's a shame, but not only is the gameplay, visuals, and sound design of World War lackluster, but the story is also virtually non-existent. This game marks the advent of yet another timeline being added to the Army Men universe, although some claim this one to be a prequel to the originals, but really it's so hard to tell because there's next to no lore in this game. The story basically boils down to throwaway, borderline no-name character tells you to go here, blow up this thing, character is never seen again, shoot tan bad guys, it's super generic. And the game ends on the PC version with the player destroying the tan Capitol building, which looks suspiciously like the Reichstag. So in short, Army Men World War PC is basically what you get when you ask your mom for Call of Duty World at War, and mom says, "We have World War at home." The PS1 version's ending is more or less the same, but instead of actually getting to storm the Reichstag, it just awkwardly cuts to a cutscene after the player destroys a giant tan tank, where we then see the player being awarded a medal and a newspaper telling us the war is over. That's it. Don't get me wrong, it's not the worst game I've played, but both versions clearly needed a lot more development time that was instead allocated to various cash grab sequels and spin-offs, all developed over the next year as PS1 exclusives. I never got to play any of these as a kid, but judging by what I could find on them, they were received similarly negative to the original World War, with World War Land, Sea, and Air being evidently so bad that Game Informer went as far to give it a 1 out of 10 rating. Overall, most of the many hastily made titles leading up to Portal Runner were received exceptionally poorly. There were a few exceptions like the sequels to Sarges Heroes and Air Attack, both being received well, but for the most part, most of these games were flops and a massive spit in the face to anyone who played the originals. Due to the fact that these games were being produced on such a tight schedule with near overlapping release dates, there simply wasn't enough time for 3DO to make a polished product with new and exciting features that so many gamers craved. As a result, the Army Men franchise understandably drew many complaints from critics pertaining to the graphics, level design, clunky controls, and even basic functionality being among the most frequent. 3DO executives were essentially killing the franchise with their insane quarterly release plan that would make even modern Activision blush. In the words of Michael Mentime once again, quote, "I always look back at my time at 3DO and think what could have been done if we had managed to brand better by releasing only one Army Men game a year, and each year releasing a different type of Army Men game with cool innovations in game mechanics. Maybe, just maybe, Army Men in 3DO might still be alive." End quote. And that brings us to Portal Runner, the game that many fans consider to be the true beginning of the end. Portal Runner is interesting, to say the least. I never played through it as a kid, though I did get my hands on a copy just for the purpose of this video, and I gave it a go. I was gonna say leave a like to express your condolences, but it's actually not nearly as bad as I expected. It was a bit clunky, but overall it was actually okay. It was definitely a massive departure from the traditional Army Men games, but given the absurd amount of those we already got, I think it's safe to say that a change was needed, so I was open to the idea of it at least. The plot basically boils down to interdimensional sorceress Bridget Blue, who can travel between worlds, wants a hubby, and our favorite green hunk of plastic Sarge is who she swiped right on. The only problem is, Sarge is currently in a committed relationship with Vicky Grimm, and this is the days before stuff got weird. Because of this, our sorceress decides she is going to lure Sarge to her, but first she needs some bait and a love gun she gets from aliens in the space dimension by trading them portal technology. That'll be important for later, and Vicky gets thrown into a portal by Bridget's literal NPC simp who worships her because of her nice blue-colored outfit, and then Vicky inexplicably gets a nice outfit of her own that I am 99% sure they made purely so they could use it as cover art. She literally just emerges from the portal and her outfit just changes. This doesn't happen in any of the other Army Men games, nor does it happen to any of the other characters in this game, but am I really going to question the logical continuity of Portal Runner of all things? Maybe a bit. So Vicky does eventually end up getting captured, and Sarge is lured to Bridget's castle, where he has the love gun used on him. That sounds very wrong because it kind of is. Sarge falls quote-unquote in love with Bridget, and they are set to get married, the wedding of which will of course be hosted by aliens because why not? Bridget then goes to Vicky's prison cell and essentially tells her she is going to allow her to watch the wedding from her magic mirror. Hold on, back up. Let me get this straight. So the game where scantily clad women run around and fight over the jacked male protagonist while one watches the other one kiss the main character is a game that wouldn't be liked by angry young men who can't get a date? I think Trip Hawkins was out of touch with that take as much as he was when he suggested GamePro would go under before 3DO did. Wow. So, okay. Pretty obvious spoiler alert, but Sarge does not actually get married to Bridget, and Vicky and her lion friend, did I mention she gets a lion as a friend? It's weird. And then there's also this random wizard guy too, but anyways, Vicky gets out of her cell, kisses Sarge, thus breaking the love gun spell, and stops the wedding. The day is saved, but not before it's revealed that the aliens that Bridget traded the portal technology to are now planning to destroy and conquer every single dimension on the other side of those portals. Because that's what aliens do, apparently. Bridget, realizing this means the world she rules over will be destroyed and taken out of her control, attempts to order the aliens to stop, but realizes she no longer holds the cards. So everyone splits up in an effort to stop the aliens, with the two jealous girls going to destroy the alien brain, which will stop the invasion, while Sarge and Leo the Lion disable a power generator to shut down the shield protecting the brain. Everyone succeeds, the world is saved, and Leo interrupts a kiss to prevent Portal Runner from becoming a T-rated game. Wait, the game was rated E? Just E? I was genuinely shocked reading that. I feel like today they'd slap at the very least a T rating on this game. What am I kidding? They couldn't even make this game today. The cancel culture swarm would have an absolute field day. The game pretty much ends how you'd expect it, with Bridget being locked in a cell, funnily enough with General Plastro, whom she mocked in the beginning of the game for being in that exact same cell in the Green Prison, and everything just ends happily ever after. Well, until the next game in the series, but we'll get into that. Honestly, I went into this one expecting to be really mad, but after the travesty that was World War and Toys in Space, I gotta say, Portal Runner, for its time at least, isn't a bad game. Granted, it's not Halo 1 or any of the other big hits of the time, but it was entertaining enough to play, and the cutscenes were kind of fun, if not cheesy. The story is a million times better than Toys in Space, and they actually did the alien subplot okay enough, even if it is a bit generic. But at the end of the day, Portal Runner is cool. I don't have much of a problem with it. Though in terms of girlfriend Sarge could have, I'm more partial to Tina Tomorrow from Toys in Space because, as a classic Halo fan, well, I gotta go with the blue girl. Well, ultimately I didn't see that much of a problem with Portal Runner. The rest of the fan base did, as did critics. In reality, I think most people were just sick and tired of the Army Men franchise at this point. I mean, look at the chart again. They released way too many of these way too frequently, so even if all these games were 9 out of 10s, which, let's face it, most of them aren't, there still would have been a massive sense of Army Men fatigue around this time. While concrete sales numbers are unavailable for most of the series, it is known that Sarges Heroes was by far the best-selling of the bunch, with about 1.3 million sales, and I can attest to this one being everywhere. In fact, it seemed to be the only Army Men game most of my friends knew about while growing up. If you said Army Men, people automatically assumed you meant Sarges Heroes or maybe Air Attack. Games like Green Rogue, which was pretty terrible, Portal Runner, or even the originals were fairly obscure just a few years after release, at least among those that I knew. Sarges Heroes, on the other hand, could be found anywhere and everywhere. I even remember finding a copy at a hair salon of all places that my mom used to go to. They used to have this small room in the back for kids to play in with loads of random toys, and at one point I remember them having a Nintendo 64, and among the games with it was Sarges Heroes, so anecdotally as well, Sarges Heroes was by far the most popular. I mean, even just going to its Wikipedia page, it's filled with details. Go to any of the other Army Men's pages, and they're basically just stubs. In a weird way, Sarges Heroes' success is what ultimately led to 3DO's downfall, as it was due to its relatively high sales numbers that the executives over at 3DO began to push the devs towards quarterly releases. To once again quote Michael Mentime, "Those early Army Men games were well reviewed, all were top 10 hits, and all made the company a lot of money. The problem was, with all the early success, the executives at 3DO thought they could spit out an Army Men game every 3 months and be successful. The entire strategy backfired by shipping so many games in such a short period of time, the quality dropped, the game mechanics became stale, and the brand started to cannibalize itself." This makes a lot of sense in hindsight. Remember earlier when I said that it wasn't Portal Runner that marked the beginning of the end, and it was actually Toys in Space and World War where the cracks started to show? Look at the release order again. It all adds up. The first few Army Men games, as Mentime himself says, did exceedingly well, and to this day they are for the most part fun to play. But anything post-Sarges Heroes is largely a dumpster fire, or bargain bin fire as these games were mostly relegated to. Like I said earlier, there were a few golden eggs. Air Attack was great, and the hate for Portal Runner is a bit overblown in my opinion. But other than that, it doesn't get better from here, only worse. A lot worse. After Portal Runner's abysmal reviews, the final World War timeline sequel called Team Assault released, and there's very little information on this one other than it wasn't even made by 3DO, it was developed by a company I've never heard of called 5,000 Feet. Not feet in distance, 5,000 literal feet. Okay, from the gameplay footage I found on YouTube, it looks awful, especially for a game from 2001. Obviously, another hastily produced, obsolete on release title from a time when other games were really pushing the envelope. Yes, these games came out the same year. After Team Assault, there was Operation Green for the Game Boy Advance. Nothing much to say there, it was a Game Boy spin-off game from the early 2000s, and like most of them, it was pretty awful. And that brings us to the last game ever released under the 3DO banner. Army Men RTS. Though the 3DO logo was on the box, 3DO themselves only published this game, with development being handed over to a company called Coyote Developments and Pandemic Studios, which was the company behind the original Star Wars Battlefronts of all things. It also, according to the Army Men wiki, happens to be one of the only Army Men games ever released in Japan where it has the interesting title of Assault Army Man, the smallest strategy in history. That's quite a mouthful, but interesting nonetheless. So, Army Men RTS was built on the same engine as the forgotten sequel to a Command & Conquer clone called Dark Reign, and it shows. If you've ever played Dark Reign 2, you've basically played Army Men RTS. This game is literally just a skin. In fact, the same studio developed both games just a few years apart. Really, I don't have much to say about this one. I didn't have it as a kid and only picked it up on GOG a few years back, and it's just painfully mediocre. This game came out in March of 2002, and what do I even say here? I mean, look at it, it's just ugly. It has the curse of every early 3D RTS, very blocky textures, weird camera controls, and not a whole lot of content compared to its predecessors. I've heard some people say it's a good introduction into the RTS genre for those who have never played it, but I would disagree. I would much more recommend something like Halo Wars for that purpose, but that's one of my favorite games of all time, so I'm biased. My biggest issue with this game has to be just how bare bones it is. Let's compare for a second to another RTS that came out actually a few years earlier. Take a look at the amount of units I have here in Red Alert 2. A decent amount of uniquely designed tanks and infantry. And that's only for one of the game's 3 factions, if you count the expansion pack, whose units I'm not even showing here. This, on the other hand, is all of Army Men RTS's units. There's a lack of variety, a lack of maps, the gameplay is nothing to gawk at, and the AI pathfinding is terrible, and for some reason the units have arbitrary limitations placed on them and behave nothing like they do in the original games. For instance, in Army Men RTS, mortar soldiers can't target infantry for some reason, which is a stark contrast when in the original games mortars were among the best weapons for taking out infantry. Another weird thing about the game is that unlike other RTSs of the time, it completely lacks a proper skirmish mode. While there is a multiplayer mode with AI enemies, they don't make sense because you can't use them unless you have 2 human players, thus making the skirmish mode impossible to play if you didn't have an internet connection at the time, or at all today since this game is obviously dead and no one's playing multiplayer. It really looks like 3DO is banking hard on the Sarges Heroes nostalgia with this one. Most of the characters from that game do return in RTS, and it seems like 3DO was hoping that brand recognition alone would lead to the game's success, but ultimately RTS just ends up feeling really derivative. Like I said before, it was literally a clone of Dark Reign 2, which itself was a clone of Command & Conquer, all during the early, awkward years of RTS games switching from 2D to 3D. Not exactly a winning formula. Army Men RTS in the end went on to receive mixed reviews at best, and at this point in mid-2002, 3DO was in a really bad position. Products were being produced and rushed to market, which costs money. Employees were working lots of overtime, which costs even more money. And sales were not meeting expectations, which doesn't make money. You know where this is going. 3DO was in a financial black hole. Not only were they still reeling from the, at this point, ancient 3DO console's miserable failure, but even the early 2000s were a struggle for the company, with 3DO reporting a net loss of over $10 million in a span of 9 months in 2002. This led to, in May of 2003, 3DO formally filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, laying off all of their employees without pay, thus effectively ending the Army Men franchise as we knew it. But it wasn't over for our favorite plastic soldiers just yet. Things were about to get a whole lot worse. If you thought Portal Runner was bad, you're really gonna hate what comes next. Once 3DO went bankrupt and subsequently shut down, they seemingly forgot to file the proper paperwork with the US government, which resulted in a Securities and Exchange Commission investigation against them. This was due to 3DO being a publicly traded company. Publicly traded companies, aka 3DO in this case, are required to register with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and provide periodic disclosures, which is to say information on how their company is doing, with things like financial earnings being made available to their investors. Obviously, they no longer did this because 3DO didn't have any employees because they shut down, but nobody told that to the US government. This led to a bit of a problem when it came to what would happen to the various IPs that 3DO had previously owned. When a company is dissolved through bankruptcy, the intellectual property rights the company owned are often sold to pay off debts. Initially, a few other companies wanted to buy 3DO outright as a whole, but the whole SEC investigation thing made it less attractive, which caused them to pull out. This resulted in 3DO's IPs and assets being split up and sold at auction. High Heat Baseball, one of the games 3DO was developing at the same time as Army Men, was sold to Microsoft. Street Racing Syndicate, another 3DO game, went to Namco. Ubisoft got Might and Magic, which was an RPG, and Take-Two Interactive acquired the rights to Army Men. Take-Two would put their subsidiary Global Star Software in charge of publishing the first Army Men game not released by 3DO, titled Army Men Sarge's War. The game's Wikipedia page credits a studio called Tactical Development as the main developer, and I cannot find anything, anywhere, about this company. Nothing comes up when you search Google, and while the in-game credits page does mention them, the list of Tactical Development employees is actually quite small, and Googling their names doesn't yield anything relevant. Whoever Tactical Development was, it seems they ultimately had a minor role in the development of Sarge's War, and it was actually 3DO who developed most of this game, despite the studio having been shut down for several years at the point of its release. Apparently some crazy stuff happened behind the scenes during the last days of 3DO, where Michael Mannheim, who I've mentioned or quoted quite a few times by now, was apparently supposed to be working on a game called 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, which was meant to be, and I quote from Mannheim himself again, an edgy, gritty, post-apocalyptic nightmare based on the Book of Revelation. Mannheim believed this game would have potentially saved 3DO from the financial black hole that had been sucking up the company over its last few years, But unfortunately for everyone, the game was sidelined by executives of 3DO, who told Mentime that there was a change of plans, and that while a small team could continue to work on the project, everyone else, including himself, was to make another Army Men game, which would be a sequel to Sarges Heroes 2. The Four Horsemen was of course ultimately cancelled, while Sarges Heroes 3 wouldn't be completed until after 3DO's demise, as the company shut down before it finished development. Mentime would later speak on this saying, quote, "Honestly, it was like developing the game on the Titanic, and it took 9 months for the ship to sink." It wasn't until after 3DO went bankrupt that Sarges Heroes 3 would be picked up by Global Star Software and renamed to Sarge's War, before being ultimately released in July of 2004, with 3DO not being credited in the startup screen or the box art. Sarge's War was, despite the publisher change and lack of obvious credit, still a 3DO game through and through. Only this was a different 3DO than the one that made the original games. One comprised of the last remnants of tired employees with extremely low morale, and given the circumstances, who could blame them? Layoffs, poor working conditions, and horrendous hours, all to produce games that were repeatedly panned by critics. Nobody won here, and you could even see the developers' frustration seep into the game itself, as Sarge's War literally starts off with a cutscene of Sarge screaming at the sky in agony while shooting blindly into the air, enraged as all his friends, or the heroes from Sarge's Heroes, were killed off in a single explosion. The entire tone of Sarge's War differs from that of the previous games. The light-hearted approach with wacky characters and funny moments are all gone. The game's color palette takes on a literal darker tone, and in a 2021 interview with Destructoid, Mentime even said, "There are certain games that you just put your heart and soul into because you love the content. They are your babies. Sarge's Heroes was one of those games for me. Every character in the game was developed with love and passion. It was fun, positive, and hopeful. It was a game that made you laugh and feel some magic. Sarge's War was the opposite of that. It was grim and dark. The story in Sarge's War was about loss, losing everything that you love and care about. In the plotline, the entire cast and crew, Sarge's Heroes died with 3DO. Everyone except for Sarge. When I killed off Sarge's Heroes, I also killed my desire to ever design another Army Men game." That has to be the saddest line I've ever heard from a game developer. It really adds context to the scene of Sarge screaming, and I can't help but believe that whoever animated that was really animating themselves, or at least how they felt after watching the franchise they built into what it was collapse under poor management and the weight of its own success. For what it's worth, at the very end of the interview, Mentime does say, quote, "There are no bad guys in this story. Everyone did their absolute best to try and keep the company alive. No one sets out to make a bad game, and no one worked harder than Trip Hawkins, who even put in his own money on the line to try and save the company." End quote. Even with all that said, I do still wonder. It really does seem like greed got the best of 3DO executives here, and that there definitely are bad guys in this story. They just weren't the 3DO employees themselves, and maybe in this case, not even Trip Hawkins, but some of the other higher-ups, they seem to have ruined it for everyone else. They stretched the studio way too thin and took unprecedented, poorly calculated risks because they really, really wanted to try and continue to milk the success of the original Sarge's Heroes. That's why they had such short development times, that's why there were so many releases with so little actual polish. It was all about the money. It kind of reminds me of another company that can't stop milking a franchise whose heydays were over 15 plus years ago. But anyways, the story of Sarge's War basically boils down to one giant death scene, both literally and symbolically. Everyone dies at the hand of a character called Lord Malice. All of Sarge's Heroes from the previous games die, and even portal-running, controversy-stirring Vicky Grimm herself dies in Sarge's arms before telling him she loves him. This is by far the most emotional point of the game. The ending consists of Sarge finding out that Lord Malice killed all of his friends out of pure malice. Get it? Yeah. Okay. Malice turns out to be some green major or something from a past mission that Sarge accidentally left behind because he believed he was dead, and Malice took that personally and then signed his allegiance over to the Tan Army, and despite the fact that the war was meant to be coming to a close, he founded some radical faction that wanted to continue it, all so he could get his revenge on Sarge for accidentally leaving him behind. Kind of generic and not really that interesting. I feel like this game's story was only written that way because of how badly 3DO just didn't want to work on Army Men anymore, and they kind of knew that, as Mentime himself said, that the ship was sinking and there was really no point. These poor developers had to go down with the ship, and they barely got any recognition for it. If you didn't go to that credit screen in Sarge's War, you would have had no idea that 3DO even had any involvement with this game. All I can say is that the management really did them dirty. Sarge's War was the last game 3DO had any involvement in, as well as the last game to properly follow any of 3DO's established timelines. This is where things somehow get even worse. Much, much worse. If you've stuck around this long, well, I thank you a ton. Leave a like and comment Major Malfunction if you've made it this far, because we are about to encounter a major malfunction. I'll show myself out. So, what is Major Malfunction other than a perfectly fitting title for the travesty that is the game of the same name? It is the 22nd episode of the Army Men series. At least according to the Star Wars-styled text crawl during this game's intro, which seems to disregard any and all of the previous canon from the other games regardless of timeline. Also, the text crawl itself. You know what? I'll just let it play. Have a listen. That's right, there is hardly any sound, no music, no narration, nothing but the birds chirping. In fact, this entire training sequence has no context other than to tell us that Private Anderson, the player character, hit his head and has lost his memory. So what does the army do? Tells him his injury isn't service related and sends him immediately back to the front where they... I'll just let the clip play again. Yep, the development studio behind this game, which is actually Team 17, who would later go on to develop Hell Let Loose and publish Trepang 2. I guess you gotta start somewhere, but anyways, the developers make all the characters in this game communicate by mumbling like it's one of those early LEGO games. And they do it very badly. Or as one IGN reviewer described it, quote, "It sounds like Charlie Brown's parents being smothered by a pillow." And that's actually pretty accurate. I didn't think it was possible for mumbling to be done so poorly, but then again, mumble rappers are a thing, so maybe this was just their first gig. I tried to play through the tutorial when I got tired of the mumble rapper in training telling me how to press the X button, so I skipped his dialogue. The game then started repeatedly playing distorted audio that wouldn't stop and sounded like someone saying "ew no" over and over again. Suffice to say, Major Malfunction was having a major malfunction. Okay, I swear that's the last time I'm using that joke. So, I am not gonna lie, I couldn't make it past this game's tutorial, not because of a lack of skill, but simply because the game wouldn't let me. The angry mumble rapper tells you you're supposed to hop over a flaming barbecue, and somehow my character literally fell through said barbecue, all while the game continued to play "ew no" over and over again. I actually went on YouTube to see if perhaps the issue was with my game specifically, maybe the disc was scratched or something was wrong with my console, but no. There is actually just no sound during the intro. The characters are supposed to mumble like that, and the barcode shadow thing under my character that you see in this footage, okay, that one actually seems to be on my end. But everything else about this game is broken. The game doesn't work, and as a result, Major Malfunction got what is some of the lowest review scores out of any of the Army Men games, which is kind of a shame because I remember getting this game as a kid from a garage sale, and if you look at the cover, it looks like it would be pretty fun, and the graphics, well dated even for 2006, are still kind of charming, but like I said, the game just doesn't work. The camera control is the worst I've seen in not just an Army Men game, but any game at all. The aiming is off, the UI makes no sense and doesn't even respond half the time. I don't know how they release this. I mean, if I paid however much this game costs on release, I would be taking it back to the store instantly. This is probably the worst Army Men game to ever exist, and the fact that it came from Team 17, such a now renowned, well-known studio, makes it even more perplexing. For those curious, the story isn't much better than the gameplay. The entirety of Major Malfunction's campaign, which is the only mode there is is derived from pop culture references and writing that is what I can only describe as the result of a fever dream that followed a night of binging 90s and early 2000s action movies. In Major Malfunction, you can expect to fight totally original enemies such as the Bride from Kill Bill, Robo-Changer, shamelessly generic Frankenstein, Black Man, Chip Hazard from Small Soldiers, and Trans Man. Yep. Okay. This game is awful, but the fever dream plot basically boils down to nothing from the previous game's matters. There is no Tan Army, no General Plastro, no mention of any of the tragic events from Sarge's War, nothing. The entire story of all the previous games has absolutely no bearing on Major Malfunction, though it does borrow a few characters. And by a few, I mean one. Literally only one. And they kill him off in the first cutscene because of course they do. Major Malfunction starts off with Sarge, the character we the players have been following for most of the games at this point, melting in a microwave in what has to be the most gruesome death scene I've seen in a while. This one was honestly kind of brutal and unnecessary, especially because it's given no context. The game just boots up and this cutscene plays. It's a little unsettling and out of place, especially considering the rest of the game is really lighthearted for some reason. It's full of random puns, sarcastic quips, and jokes that don't land. I can't even call them dad jokes, it's just an unnecessary amount of sarcasm and cynicism, but without context or reason. Without context or reason basically sums up the whole plot of this game. While I didn't finish it all the way through myself, I did watch some playthroughs on YouTube, and yeah, nothing really makes sense. You play through the campaign pretty much entirely on your own with no AI companions. There is no established green army to be found anywhere, and the game's world building is non-existent. Any kind of logic or continuity is so busted at best or non-existent at worst that the plot is just hard to understand. Things just happen with little context or explanation given, and we the players are just supposed to accept it. I know this is kind of a thing with all the Army Men games to some degree, but not quite to this extent. Major Malfunction has no properly established factions, no character motivations, and no connection to the rest of the Army Men lore. Again, there is no Tan Army at all, the antagonists from pretty much all of the games. The Green Army is mentioned but never really seen. Random rogue toys that have never been known to have any intelligence before in the Army Men universe now do all of a sudden and roam around apparently being led by the main antagonist, which is of course Major Malfunction. We don't know why they're loyal to him, they just are, which is weird because later in the game we find out through the awful aggressive mumbling dialogue sequences that Major Malfunction is actually, are you ready for this one? Spoiler alert, Major Malfunction is Sarge. The same Sarge that got melted in the intro cutscene, and once again the same Sarge that we played as in most of the other games. That is the main villain of the last Army Men game that sort of followed the original Sarges Heroes timeline. I guess this was meant to be a massive plot twist, but it has two problems. For one, it's basically the same twist used in Sarge's War, the previous game of the series. The whole Sarge is the bad guy part is explained away by claiming seemingly out of nowhere by Anderson that when Sarge got microwaved, he also went back in time and lost his mind. Right, where do I begin? There are so many interesting angles that could have been taken with that story. Maybe have Sarge go back in time and try to bring back Vicky and the others but fail. Maybe have the two distinct 3DO timelines merge. Maybe reveal that Dr. Mad from Army Men 2 has something to do with all of this. Of course, the writers did none of this and just said Sarge was crazy and made a fake army that does absolutely nothing because reasons. All the other random toys exist solely for the player to have something to shoot at. Like I said, the world building in Major Malfunction is pretty much non-existent, but let's go back to the toys themselves for a minute. Unlike in the previous games, they make zero sense. In the original Army Men's, we see things like, well, Army Men for starters, and then other secondary characters, such as UFOs, a teddy bear, both hostile and friendly insects, construction vehicles, all things that you'd expect to find at a kid's toy box or a backyard. But why would a kid have 50 of the same knockoff Kill Bill action figures? Why would there be loads of Chip Hazards from Toy Soldiers? Lore-wise, the writers could have explained this. We've seen in previous games that both the Green and the Tan armies are constantly experimenting to turn out more soldiers and weapons for their side. They could have said that maybe there was some kind of clone army thing going on, but of course there is no explanation. Everything is just derivative and generic and, quite frankly, some of the laziest writing I've ever seen. One of the things that made the 3DO Army Men so charming was that, despite the fact that it was plastic soldiers that were alive, it was all kind of believable. The toys in those games, and just as importantly the amount of them, made logical sense. The stories felt like the boxes of toy soldiers actually came alive, and that was the central point of the entire series. It was perfectly feasible to believe that a kid could in fact have a backyard full of 100 or so plastic soldiers, but seeing dozens of these random robots or weird yellow tracksuit wearing dolls feels thematically out of place. I mean, this is an Army Men game. They could have put, Army Men as the main antagonists, with the larger toys appearing as some kind of special enemies maybe, but what do I know? So the game ends with a cutscene which is, like the rest of the game, completely nonsensical and devoid of context. After Major Malfunction, or Sarge, is defeated, a random spaceship appears literally flying through a window, touches down, and no one is actually driving it. Anderson gets into the spaceship and then flies off. The scene then cuts to Anderson being awarded a medal by a very scary-looking flight attendant Barbie doll in a scene that is very reminiscent to the ending of the original Star Wars movie. And there's an alien there because, well, it's never explained. There's a post-credits scene where it's revealed that Major Malfunction wasn't killed and that he's basically the Terminator. I mean, the scene is literally almost a copy and paste of the scene from Terminator 2. At the end of the day, Major Malfunction is, in my opinion, at least by far, not only the worst Army Men game, but also the worst game I've ever played. But what if I told you that it somehow got even worse? After Major Malfunction was a major flop, Global Star Software stopped publishing Army Men games, and the brand somehow ended up in the hands of a company called Zoo Games and Big Blue Bubble. Has anyone else ever heard of this studio? I haven't. A quick Wikipedia search shows that they are most well known for mobile games, including the atrocity called My Singing Monster that was in every other YouTube ad a couple of years ago. Great. I'm sure whatever they produce is going to be extra fruitful. Oh. Army Men Soldiers of Misfortune. What a fitting name. I'm honestly starting to wonder if the developers were intentionally making a joke out of it at this point. Soldiers of Misfortune seems to have largely been forgotten to time, as I couldn't even find a trailer for it on YouTube, and the review scores were absolutely abysmal, and deservedly so. While the camera controls are slightly better than Major Malfunction, this game isn't even an Army Men game. In fact, I'm not sure if this is officially part of the Army Men franchise at all. Both Wikipedia and the Army Men wiki list it as an official game, but everything about it looks fake. From the blatantly obvious change in story, art style, and gameplay, to the logo on the box art looking different. I mean, even Major Malfunction kept that classic Army Men logo that has been there pretty much since the beginning, but Soldiers of Misfortune just looks different in every way. But assuming it is official, it's clearly some kind of reboot. There is no Tan Army, there is no Green Army. There are hardly any vehicles, the enemy and weapon variety is scarce to say the least, and there's no voice acting. In fact, this game hardly has any sound effects at all. The story, if you even want to call it that, is about a kid playing in his room with toy soldiers. Yes, you play as the kid, not as the Army Men. It's almost like a similar effect could have been achieved by just playing with an actual box of toy soldiers. The gameplay is literally just a kid running around his room shooting at plastic men with an off-brand Nerf gun, the only catch being he's shrunk down to be the same size as the Army Men. Why would anyone want to play this? How did we go from this, an interesting, fairly grounded for what it was game about real combat plastic men, a tagline that they have now dropped by the way, to Little Timmy's knockoff Nerf adventure? And I'm serious, the kid's name in the story is literally Timmy. I'm not making that up. The game doesn't even seem to have real cutscenes, it's just these slideshow pictures with lore, quote unquote, that reads like something I would have written as an 8-year-old. As a matter of fact, I have here an actual workbook from when I was in elementary school. And well, I'll just read it to you. When I get home, I will play with my army men. I will have a big war. Every war I play has a name. I will name this one the Power Trooper War. It will be the biggest war ever. The Soldiers of Misfortune intro isn't far off from that, and all the interesting factions and nuance of the story from the originals or the Sarges Heroes series isn't there. There aren't even any real characters aside from the kid you play as and Major Teddy, who doesn't have any lines. It's just said through the text intro that he, quotes, outlines the new strategies to defeat the Tan forces. Look, I understand the target demographic for this game was clearly shifted to a younger audience compared to the originals, but this just isn't it. Soldiers of Misfortune has absolutely no reference or connection whatsoever to any of the other games. It's not even really a reboot. It's almost as if this company maybe acquired the rights and figured through brand recognition alone that they would con parents who were out of the loop into buying it. I do not know anyone who liked Soldiers of Misfortune, never mind played it. It's just insulting, and to make matters worse, this was the last proper, I think, official Army Men game to ever be released. This was in 2008 as well, and I mean, just look at this. 2008, we had Call of Duty World at War, we had Halo 3 ODST. Gaming was at its absolute peak around this time, and yet that is the best Army Men came up with. It's just shameful at this point. To see the franchise I knew and loved become this, it's almost as bad as modern day Halo. In fact, in some ways, I think it's worse. After Soldiers of Misfortune, while we thankfully didn't get any more fully fledged titles, we did get 2 mobile games from 2 different publishers, those being Connect 2 Media in 2010 for Army Men Mobile Ops, which is what it sounds like, and Volcanic Force Studio in 2017 for Army Men Strike, another game that I'm uncertain of its status of official or not. The thing that's odd about this one is that it's still on the Google Play Store, but it's completely dropped the name Army Men from its title. It actually seems to be quite popular if the number of downloads is to be believed, but I'm not sure if this has any relation at all to the original Army Men franchise, at least not officially, since it's made by a random no-name company out of China, and the fact that it dropped Army Men entirely from its name after release is a bit of a red flag. That almost makes me think that perhaps there was some kind of copyright dispute or whatever. According to the Army Men wiki, it is official, but beyond the name of the developer and the fact that a few old characters return from Sarges Heroes, there isn't a lot of info on it despite its alleged popularity. So I'm leaning more towards this game not being an official product. It's hard to tell though, because oddly enough, the more current you get into researching the Army Men games, the less information seems to be available. It's like everything from who worked on the games to sales numbers to even just simple YouTube videos featuring the games has become so obscure and irrelevant to modern gaming that nobody cares to document it. It's been almost totally lost to time. In fact, these mobile games, the last of them being released almost 8 years ago now, is all we've heard of from the Army Men series. That's, again, if those mobile games were even made in an official capacity. As far as I can tell, there isn't even any official social media presence, and fan pages like the Army Men subreddit are so tiny it seems that this series as a whole has been essentially forgotten about and lost to time. In the absence of any official Army Men games, there have been a few unofficial games and spiritual successors that have come out over the years, including a fan-made sequel to the original games called Army Men 3. However, for one reason or another, it was never finished, and what has been made of the game is rough around the edges to say the least. It was also done in the third-person shooter format of the Sarges Heroes series, which I found quite strange, given the fact that the original Army Men games were all isometric, and since 3 is meant to be a sequel to those, it just seemed a bit of an odd choice to not follow in their footsteps. I'd be curious to see what a modern isometric Army Men game would look like, and with time, who knows what will come. I've noticed in the indie scene especially, isometric as a genre seems to be making somewhat of a small comeback. Though Army Men itself making any kind of comeback I would say is unlikely, given the fact that, as I mentioned before, nobody seems interested or to even remember this series. Maybe this video will prove me wrong on that. I kinda hope it does, but we'll see. Another fan game I think is worth mentioning is Attack on Toys, which I've actually covered on this channel a while ago. It's a pretty cool game. It definitely follows more in the spirit of Sarges Heroes than the originals, and it adds in pretty extensive base building, which is kinda cool. Though, while it does have loads of content, it tends to lack polish in some areas. The gunplay's a bit wonky, vehicles feel weird, but it's nice to look at, a good bit of fun for a few hours, and I'm pretty sure you can grab it for free on itch.io, or support the developer on Steam if you have the money. Maybe I'll make an updated video on that at some point, since the last one I did was over 3 years ago or something. Let me know if that's something you want to see. So at this point I've covered pretty extensively the history of the Army Men series from a real-world perspective. However, I didn't want to end this video on such a negative note, and so I wanted to save what I enjoyed the most out of these games for last. And that is the story of the original games, meaning Army Men 1 and Army Men 2 specifically. While the Sarges Heroes games did have their own unique timeline, that one, as I mentioned earlier, was more focused around individual characters rather than world building in the larger universe. The original Army Men's, however, had loads of world building, and this is where it gets really interesting. Let's dive in. Army Men 1 from 1998 starts off with an invasion of the Green Nation's territory by the Tan Army. At the very beginning of this video, I had mentioned that the series takes place in real-life locations that are basically supersized to serve as battlefields for the toy soldiers. So the kitchen, sink, your desk, or maybe a shed or an attic, and so on. This, however, is not actually the case with Army Men 1. Specifically, in fact, it is the only mainline game outside the World War series that's like this all the way through. In the first Army Men, the setting takes place in what is called the Plastic World, which is, as it sounds, a world made entirely out of plastic and other artificial materials. Just like our own world, the Plastic World has unique geography, countries, and global politics. As far as the factions go, there is, of course, the aforementioned Green and Tan nations, with Green being a sort of plastic version of mid-1900s America, and Tan being YouTube advertiser unfriendly. I've seen a lot of people compare Army Men to World War II, but that isn't an entirely accurate comparison, as most of the troops are seen carrying M16s and driving tanks that were made in the real-life 50s and 60s. Combine this with the fact that the main antagonist of the series' name, General Plastro, is a play on the word Castro, like Fidel Castro. So really, the Army Men series is more of a mix between a World War II and Vietnam-era timeline, which kind of aligns with the toy soldiers you see in real life. They're usually a mix of the same thing, so it translates over to the games. But anyways, in addition to the Green and Tan nations, you also have two minor factions, being the Blues and the Greys. The Blue Nation is a sort of neutral faction with its own goals and territory that occasionally works with both the Green and the Tan, trading information when it's convenient for them. Then there's the Grey Nation, which is this weird mix of a sort of old, antiquated society as well as mad scientists that are slightly into the occult. That's going to be important in a bit. The actual story of the first game is, unlike other entries in the series, fairly light when it comes to characters, as there's only a few, with the player assuming the role of Sarge, which I need to point out here is not the same Sarge from Sarges Heroes. As a kid, I always assumed these two characters to be either A, the same person just with an updated appearance in the later games, or B, a reboot of the same character, but this is not actually the case. Sarge as we know him in the Sarges Heroes timeline is actually Sergeant Hawk, a separate person from the main player character in the isometric series who is simply known as just Sarge. They look different, they've even got different girlfriends, and their personalities are different, with Sarge from the OG Army Men being a lot more reserved and even-tempered than Sergeant Hawk from the Sarges Heroes timeline. Just wanted to make that distinction before I go any further. Throughout the first game, Sarge is tasked with collecting information. It starts off in the first level with a spy from the Blue Nation trading some info to the Tans. You're tasked with intercepting him, and basically you find out through the course of the game that the Tan are up to no good and searching for the activation index to the first Halo ring. Okay, not really, but like many games of its era, Army Men 1 has the trope of multiple keys or items needing to be found to activate some powerful ancient artifact that will either save the day or doom everyone. So the player is tasked with collecting these keys, which look like those little Tinker toy connecting things everyone played with as kids. Basically, once you get all three keys, you can get to and activate the thing the Tan is looking for, though at first it isn't quite clear what that thing is. The method of obtaining those keys includes invading a Tan stronghold, robbing a bank to steal plastic, which is this game's version of money, to bribe the Blue Nation, to give you information on the location of another key, which you then of course find before finally working with an old retired colonel from the Grey Nation, which will for some reason attack you even though the old man himself is friendly. It really isn't elaborated on that much, but basically you need to fight through this old city, kill a bunch of tan and gray soldiers as they sometimes fight each other, and then you'll get information on where to find the artifact that the mysterious keys unlock. While it isn't explicitly stated, it is implied that the keys are originally from another world that is separate from the plastic one the Armymen inhabit. If you've been paying attention, you know exactly where this is going. It is ultimately revealed that hiding within an old cemetery in the Grey Nation's borders is a portal of unknown origin. Sarge then goes to the cemetery, finds the portal, enters it, where he is then teleported to the real world. A giant-sized kitchen, to be precise. Now remember, at this point in the Armymen universe, it is shown that the plastic world is completely separate from our own, and that the Armymen that live there are completely oblivious to any other world's existence. They have no idea what the real world is, they have no knowledge or concept that living in a plastic world is not the normal state of being, so Sarge sees this, is very confused, and the game ends on a cliffhanger. A newspaper reel flashes by on the screen stating that Sarge is missing, and the game just abruptly ends. One thing I do have to give credit for, however, is that Armymen 2 picks up exactly where we left off in Armymen 1, and this is something I actually quite liked. Literally, the same kitchen where you see Sarge looking around confused at the end of the first game is exactly the same in the second, and that level of continuity is something I appreciate and wish more games would do that, instead of skipping years ahead with every new entry and never tying up loose ends. I'm not talking about anything in particular here. I'm just saying. But anyways, Armymen 2 starts off with Sarge in the real world and the infamous Tan Commander Plastro standing outside the portal in the Grey Cemetery, with a bunch of Tan soldiers who begin marching into the portal on his orders when he shortly after follows behind. But something is lurking in the trees behind Plastro. Immediately after he enters the portal, crossing into the real world to pursue Sarge and co., several Tan soldiers as well as a blue spy uncloak themselves. We have never seen cloaking technology in the Armymen games before, and never see it again as far as I remember. But yeah, it's here, and one of the soldiers towards the front of the group has a mysterious armband and a different outfit to the others. He orders the soldiers with him to destroy the portal once Plastro enters. As a kid, I always misinterpreted this scene to be the cloaked soldiers making it so no one could follow the general, but now I realize they did this because they were actually conspiring against him, which will be important to the story again in a little while. So Sarge, now in the real world, flees with a few of his men who also entered the portal with him, across the kitchen and away from the Tan soldiers. They eventually encounter giant roaches before reaching a cookie jar that has a mysterious sound coming from it. Blowing it open with rockets, Sarge and crew realize that the cookie jar contains yet another portal. This is a recurring theme throughout the game where portals take Sarge from one place to another, sometimes transferring him from the plastic world to the real world or vice versa. He eventually gets back in touch with Command, helps the Green Army deliver tanks to the front lines, and is informed by HQ that a Green Colonel has gone missing and is sent to find him. When he arrives at the Colonel's last known location, before being informed by a Green Recon Force that the Colonel has gone rogue and started off a cult comprised of soldiers from all different armies with the ultimate goal of uniting against them and wiping everyone out as a way to achieve world peace, with the logic that if there are no armies, there will be no more war. Right. So Sarge tracks down the rogue Colonel to an ancient temple before he flees through a portal contained within it, which further suggests that the portals are in fact the product of some potential Forerunner civilization. Where have we heard this one before? Sarge follows through the portal where he surfaces onto a large pathway in the real world, surrounded by soldiers of all colors who refuse to join the Colonel's cult. The Colonel, as retaliation for their disobedience and as a way to rid the world of the soldiers, straps literal bombs to them. This level is actually kinda dark. The doomed men run up to Sarge in a desperate attempt to get help, but Sarge is ultimately forced to put them down before they get too close, as even he cannot remove the explosives. By the end of the level, the Colonel tells Sarge that he and his men have all been lied to and they don't understand how the world actually works, which almost makes me think he has a point. The Colonel and his men seem to be the only one who are actually concerned about the real world even being a thing, so was he really just a villain with a point maybe? Regardless, Sarge has no time for his hippie bullshit and puts the crazed Colonel out of his misery. The story gets even weirder from this point, as the next mission has Sarge sent to yet another island to investigate a helicopter crash. When he arrives, he finds the sole survivor of that crash, an old man tied to a chair. Once he frees the old man from his restraints, both of them are suddenly surrounded by zombies, which are comprised of the severed limbs from different colored soldiers. As you progress through the level, it's revealed that these zombies are the creation of Dr. Mad, and the Grey Nation, who has been doing some pretty strange experiments on the island. Sarge fights his way through the undead, destroying Dr. Mad's zombie factory before Dr. Mad flees. I think now is probably a good time to mention that Armymen 2 had these you lose cutscenes that would play every time the player dies, and they start off fairly normal, with maybe Sarge trying to catch a plane and then he falls while being chased by tan soldiers, or just a military gravesite, but the one that's exclusive to this level is just disturbing. I don't know how they put this in a kid's game, but I guess the whole making the soldiers plastic instead of real to avoid censorship kind of worked here. But anyways, the next few missions are mostly filler, and there's also a significant difficulty spike for some reason and an overall drop in quality of the levels themselves. I get the impression that this is because, as mentioned at the start of this video, at the time 3DO was making several Army Men games at once. This is an issue that's going to affect the lore very soon. One mission in particular that was really annoying was the fortress level, where you're tasked with destroying a nuclear golf ball launcher. Yes, that's a thing. But the whole mission is just very poorly designed. It's quite long, but only because it requires a lot of backtracking, and it's pretty buggy with the disguises you have to use to complete it, not working half the time. And, well, yeah, it's just filler and there isn't a lot here, so moving on. After the filler missions are over, Sarge finally reaches Major Mylar, who is, at this point, in control of most of the Tan Army, since getting rid of Plastro at the beginning of the game. Sarge kills Mylar in the real world, also destroying his castle in the process, when it's revealed that Plastro actually survived and has been watching from the sidelines the entire time, with Tan troops of his own still loyal to him, as well as some giant cockroaches that his men have tamed from the kitchen level. After Plastro is revealed to be alive, there's one final cutscene where we see Major Mylar's half-melted body being reassembled by Dr. Mad, who is at this point still at large. The game ends there on another cliffhanger. It's really a shame too, as I felt that Army Men 2 really sets up a lot of interesting plot lines that are ultimately never resolved. We never find out exactly what the Colonel was talking about. We don't find out why Mylar tried to kill Plastro. We never find out who that blue spy was at the beginning, what happened to Dr. Mad, and why he wanted Mylar's corpse. The Green and Tan conflict is never resolved either, nor is the whole interdimensional portal thing. All of this really interesting lore that sets up for a great third game is completely dropped. Because the next and final installment in the original Army Men timeline is Toys in Space, which I already covered why it's such a bad game in terms of gameplay, but now I want to talk about the lore specifically. I know I said I didn't want to end this video on such a bad note, but I have to cover this as it is part of the OG timeline. Regrettably. The story starts off with a tiny spaceship crash landing inside a sandbox, in the real world. It's not known where it is, as this real world doesn't resemble any of the real worlds from the previous game. But the Tan Army reaches the spaceship first and then forms an alliance with the aliens inside. We're never told explicitly why. While this is happening and Sarge and his men are rushing for the spaceship too, they end up meeting a blue lady named Tina Tomorrow, who is apparently the leader of the Galactic Army. The existence of aliens and a galactic army is glossed over and barely even acknowledged or discussed. Green HQ then gets invaded by a mix of alien and Tan forces. Sarge of course defends it, and okay, I know I'm not going to talk about the levels too much here, but this level is awful. It doesn't make sense from a lore perspective, and the gameplay just sucks. Firstly, in terms of story. We know from the original game that the Green Nation originated in the plastic world. So why would their HQ and capital city be located in a bedroom in the real world? Secondly, the level design itself is just bad. Because of the Army Men game's notoriously bad NPC pathfinding and collision, they get stuck everywhere, and the entire objective of this mission is to escort the NPC civilians to safety before Tan and the aliens kill them. It's not a good mix, and if that wasn't bad enough, the voice acting in Toys in Space is insufferable. The entire mission has NPCs screaming into Xbox mics from 2003. Have a listen. There's a clear, drastic drop in quality from Army Men 2 to Toys in Space here, and the second half of the game isn't much better, with levels being bland, uninteresting, and all feeling like they were rushed because, well, they were. Army Men 2, Toys in Space, Army Men 3D, Army Men Air Attack, and Sarges Heroes all came out in the same year, with Toys in Space releasing just a few months after 2. And this makes me think that it's very possible that the plot of 2 wasn't finished being written by the time Toys in Space was being made. And that's why literally all of the interesting plot lines from 2 and the original game never get mentioned or addressed. The portals barely make an appearance in Toys in Space, and it's never even addressed what exactly they are or who put them there. Like I said before, the whole Major Mylar Dr. Mad Plastro plotline is also dropped. The Blue and Gray Nations aren't even in the game, and there's no fleshing out of the new factions at all. The game ends with General Plastro yet again being revealed to have been watching from the shadows, so I guess he's still alive, but we don't really find out what happened to him after Army Men 2. And then Sarge and Tina get together at a fireworks show, but that's it. We don't find out what Sarge's fate is. We don't get any information about the fate of the Tan Army or the rest of the aliens. All of the unanswered questions from Army Men 2 remain unanswered. And that's that. That is the end of the classic Army Men timeline. And I think that's one of the greatest tragedies of all, because there were the bones of a fantastic universe there that would never be fully realized, as it does just abruptly end with Toys in Space, which, like I said, seems to suffer from the fact that Army Men 2 wasn't even done yet by the time of its development, which is probably why the story feels so weird. It's a shame because, obviously as a channel that used to focus primarily on Halo content, I'm a massive fan of military sci-fi as a genre, and Toys in Space had such a cool concept. I mean, even the cutscenes are really cool for their time. The character design I absolutely love. The Galactic Army's outfits are cool. Like, everything about this game could be cool. It's like a collection of good ideas that weren't executed properly. And a bit of a controversial take here, but I've always massively preferred the designs of the OG Army Men to the Sarges Heroes art style. Classic Army Men is a little bit grittier and realistic, while Sarges Heroes, everything is too overdone. I don't hate the Sarges Heroes timeline, of course, they're just a bit excessive. I like the more realistic theme of the isometric games, and to me, that is what I think of when I think of Army Men. I know others will have had a different experience, and most people do probably prefer Sarges Heroes over the classic ones, and that's fine, but I just think that regardless, the way this series ended, the fact that 3DO saw the success of Sarges Heroes back in 1999 and then proceeded to completely drop the timeline that they themselves started, it just really rubs me the wrong way. I mean, these games, Army Men as a franchise, quite literally collapsed under the weight of its own success. They went from these slightly clunky titles that could be really appreciated by the right audience to blatant shovelware designed to appeal to unsuspecting parents and gamers who didn't know any better and got tricked into picking one up from the bargain bin. And I really hate to say that. This video was not meant to be as long as it is. The original concept for it was just for me to play through Toys in Space, as it was the last of the original games I hadn't played all the way through, and it had been sitting in my GOG library for quite some time. I was originally meant to just play it, check it out, and talk about all my cool memories with the early games, and maybe lightly touch on Air Attack, as that was one of my favorites as well. Clearly, it's become much more than that. Learning about the history of 3DO was interesting, and I had a blast going through the classics, though I did become aware of some flaws that I never noticed as a kid. However, I will say that Air Attack hasn't aged a day, and Portal Runner, for all the hates it gets, is actually pretty cool. But I felt genuine anger when I played through Toys in Space, and don't even get me started on Major Malfunction again, or Soldiers of Misfortune. Do I even have to say it? How the hell did we go from this to whatever the hell this is? At the end of the day, Army Men is yet another franchise that lost its core identity and has been passed around way too many developers, so much so that it's probably better it just remains at rest and obscure at this point. I don't want any official revival or reboot of this game, because if we ever got one, I have a bad feeling it would end up just like modern Halo. And well, those of you who have been on my channel know how that turned out. But that brings me to the end of this very, very long video. Thank you so much for watching. If you've stuck with me all the way to the end, you are seriously an absolute legend, and I hope you enjoyed my nostalgia-fueled journey into heartbreak and disappointment. Oh well, at least we still have the good Army Men games, and yes, some of these games are fantastic. I know many in the gaming community who remember the Army Men franchise with nothing but contempt, and will say that they're all subpar garbage, but those people couldn't be more wrong. I'll still be playing Air Attack, Army Men 2, and the original for years to come, but that's it for me. What do you think of the Army Men games? Which one was your first, and which was your favorite or least favorite? Share some memories in the comments below. I would love to reminisce with y'all. Before I go, I also want to say a quick shout out to the people over at the Army Men wiki, as the articles they wrote pointed me to a lot of interesting information. Also, shout out to my wonderful wife for helping me with some of the graphics in this video, as well as putting up with my absolute insanity during the long days and nights researching for this video. And of course, thank you, the viewer, again for watching this video. Stay safe as always, and have a great day. Now, I've got a portal to fly into.